Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the results of the first national serological survey of COVID-19 and how it reveals the failure of India's containment strategy. We also talk about why farmers in states like Punjab and Haryana are protesting three ordinances of the central government despite them actually being progressive. But first, we talk about the India-China border tensions. It has now been over 4 months since the standoff between the two sides started at the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. As discussed previously on the show, the Chinese have transgressed along at least 4 points on the LAC: Pangongso, the Galwan Valley, Hot Springs, and Depsang. On June 15 in the Galwan Valley, clashes had taken place between the two sides that killed 20 Indian soldiers and an unspecified number of Chinese soldiers. The situation further intensified last week when warning shots were fired for the first time in 45 years along the LAC. Multiple military and diplomatic talks have taken place over the past 4 months, but they have resulted in only limited disengagement. However, last Thursday, a meeting took place between External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Moscow. And after the meeting, a joint statement was issued that said that the two sides should, quote, continue the dialogue, quickly disengage, maintain proper distance, and ease tensions, unquote. And it also talked about adopting a 5-point approach to resolve the crisis. In this segment, Shubhajit Roy, Indian Express's associate editor and who reports on matters of foreign affairs for the paper, joins us to talk about the significance of the statement.
To understand this context, essentially the two foreign ministers had spoken to each other after the Galwan clash. They have participated in virtual meetings, which are trilateral or multilateral between RIC ministers, Russia, India, China ministers, or the BRICS foreign ministers meetings. But this was the first time that they were in a room in Moscow discussing the issue of the situation along the border.
The meeting lasted nearly 2.5 hours, and after it, the joint statement was issued.
Now, the fact that they came up with a joint statement itself is seen as a forward movement because so far, after every meeting or a conversation between the two sides, whether be it between the military commanders or diplomats or the foreign ministers or the defense ministers or the national security advisors, both sides had issued separate statements so far, which meant that there were divergences in how the two sides interpreted the conversation. This was the first time in the last 4 months that a joint statement was made, basically meaning that they were on the same page as regards to the language of the statement.
In the past, the two sides, in a way, had been talking at each other. But this changed that. The joint statement, like mentioned earlier, also talks about a 5-point approach. The situation at the LAC has remained tense with heavy deployment on both sides. In some areas where troops ordinarily remain 15 to 20 kilometers apart, according to sources, they are now only 500 meters away. In this regard, Shubhajit explains, the most crucial thing about the joint statement and its 5-point approach is the emphasis on quick disengagement and maintaining distance at the LAC.
Essentially, they should not be within the firing range of each other. So the broad point is that the two sides decided that they must disengage and should expedite work to conclude certain confidence building measures to maintain peace along the border.
Shubhajit says that along with this, the joint statement referred to the consensus that had been reached by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping in the past, during the 18 meetings in the last 6 years. And that it also referred to the various existing agreements between India and China that talk about peace. This statement and the meeting between Jaishankar and Wang Yi, in light of the recent tensions, holds significance. Though there are limits to how optimistically one can view this development. One key thing pointed out by many is that while there has been talk of normalcy and peace and tranquility along the border, There has been no explicit mention of the status quo ante in the statement, something that India has been demanding since May. Status quo ante essentially means the restoration of things as they were in April of this year. But even apart from this, Shubhajit points out to another divergent note that came after the meeting.
The Chinese side issued a statement where they interpreted some of the Indian comments differently than how India would like to see. Firstly, it said that Wong had conveyed China's stern position on the situation in the border areas, and he had talked about immediately stop provocations such as firing, which the Chinese side have accused Indians. Indians obviously deny that and say that the Chinese side had fired weapons along the LSC. The Chinese side also sort of said that the Indian External Affairs Minister had delinked the state of border with the state of relationship, which the Indian side completely deny and say that that is not what the Indian Foreign Minister had said. So these show that even after 2.5 hours of a meeting and coming up with a joint statement, which was issued by the two sides, there still are divergences which remain between the two sides of what they took away from the meeting.
In the meeting, Jaishankar had made it clear that maintenance of peace and tranquility along the border is absolutely essential to the forward development of ties.
Because India has taken series of steps from a ban on these apps which have Chinese links, a Chinese ownership, as well as India has tightened the screws on Chinese investments. So that has sent out a clear economic message. At the military level, it has sent out a message that by massive deployment along the LSC, it has pushed back or sort of tried to even the table and even captured some of the heights in the south bank of Pangong Tso Lake. So, in such a situation, India would want, and that is what has been made clear, that the provocative behavior of Chinese troops has shown complete disregard for bilateral agreements since 1993. And the Chinese side has not been able to provide a credible explanation for this massive deployment of troops and arms.
The Indian side during the meet made it clear that the troop deployment has to go back to their permanent post, and the phasing of the process needs to be worked out by the military commanders.
So, in a sense, in the next few days, we should expect that a military level commanders meeting should take place in the next few days, which will work out the disengagement plan. Now, unless that happens, only that will be a proof that the political message has been sent out to the ground level troops and to the military commanders. And that is when India can see that there can be disengagement at the ground level and a de escalation over the next few months.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Next, we talk about the COVID-19 crisis. Last week on Friday, a study on the first national serological survey was published. Serosurveys, or serological surveys, are essentially done to assess the prevalence of a disease in the population. In this case, to know how many people already have had COVID-19. This is done by detecting the presence of specific antibodies in people. The macro findings of this first national serological survey had been made public in June by ICMR, the nodal agency in charge of overseeing it. The survey, which tested 30,000 people, revealed that the estimated caseload in the country in May was 64 lakh infections. This was in sharp contrast to India's official caseload at the time, which was only a little over 52,000 infections, around 123 times less.
It was significant at that point of time because it covered not only the hotspots in urban centers, but what we call as the mild infections where there were very less prevalence, as well as zero districts.
That's Kaunain Sheriff, and he reports on health for the paper. He explains that in June, the full report of the survey was not released. But now, the full data has been released, and a peer-reviewed study of the survey has been published in the Indian Journal of Medical Research.
So one of the most significant findings of this study, which still holds relevance, is the fact that in the 233 districts, which the government at that point of time in May was calling it as zero caseload, which means that you didn't have infections, actually had an estimated 8.56 lakh infections, which says that there was clearly an under detection of cases in these centers. Why is this important? Because these zero district centers were mostly rural centers or semi-urban centers, which were in the vicinity of the urban hotspots.
This means that in these 233 districts where the government thought there were no cases, no containment strategy could be implemented and the virus continued to spread. And this, Kaunain says, was at a time when the pandemic was not at its peak in India.
There is very interesting data which is part of the study. The study looked at around 6,000 people in these zero districts. 20% of them were employed in occupations with high exposure to the virus. Even 53% of them had already sought medical care for respiratory related diseases. 34% of them already had a history of hospitalization when they underwent the serosurveillance. Although only 1.5% had a direct contact with the COVID-19 case. If you actually look at all of these, only 0.1 had been actually tested by RT-PCR test. So when you're saying that 19% of the population who were in the zero districts had not been tested, even though they were in a high exposure zone of the virus. So this says or puts a big question mark on our surveillance strategy, our containment strategy, and what we call as the house-to-house contact tracing. So the fact that this 8.6 lakh people were not in the actual infection caseload of the country, that means that they were outside in the general population spreading the virus.
He says that if we were to take the reproduction rate of 2, these people would have at least been infecting 2 other people. In the beginning, testing for the virus is actually a containment strategy, because when you find someone positive, you isolate them and stop them from spreading the virus. But here, like Kaunain mentioned earlier, 53% of the 6,000 had already sought medical attention for respiratory problems and yet weren't tested.
So the big question mark here is, or the biggest learning for us here is not just the testing, but when you know that these are the people who are coming in contact with a healthcare facility, you have to first do contact tracing. You have to then what we call as a containment zone. You have to create a containment zone. And third, of course, you have to test the entire zone. So this is what is the takeaway, which still holds relevance for us right now.
While India has significantly increased testing, containment measures continue to remain weak. Last week, Indian Express had reported that the central government is now directly speaking to the district administrations of Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, states which have some of the highest number of cases. Kaunain says that the government spoke to 17 districts in these states that last week constituted about 44% of all cases in the country.
So the biggest takeaway or the glaring gap in this was on surveillance and containment. So when each of the districts had almost 200 teams of ASHA workers, of the local medical officers, however, no one knew how to go and do contact tracing. No one knew if a person is found in a house who's tested positive, how many persons you have to contact trace. They didn't know what are the questions that have to be asked during contact tracing. Another big question mark was on the containment zone. You've seen that the Union Health Ministry has now flagged, especially in Maharashtra, that the positivity rate among the doctors and the nurses is very high. So when this was investigated, it was found that you have not created containment zones around where the doctors reside. So, they are getting not just from the hospitals, but also from the general population. So right now, we are still lacking at least the centers which are reporting very high number of cases, because you need to understand that the incubation period of the infection is 14 days. So you have to contain the spread of the virus if it is found within a geographical area, that you have to stop the spread of the virus in this 14 days. However, in the same 14 days, if you're reporting fresh cases, that means your containment strategy, your contact tracing, your house-to-house surveillance has all failed.
Kaunain says that now the government has created new standard operating procedures which are more visual, and has also asked these state governments to translate them in local languages.
It gives you granular details for an ASHA worker or a chief medical officer as to what is the questions that you have to ask, how many number of persons you have to do a contact tracing, and after contact tracing, how do you monitor that exact containment zone. So this is the biggest challenge, because we are testing 1 million a day right now. But however, you can keep testing, but if you don't do containment, surveillance and contact tracing, then these numbers are going to go up exponentially.
Though right now there are several questions being raised about testing as well. There are many who are developing symptoms but are hesitant to get tested, something that has been pointed out by several experts. And understanding how important testing is, Kaunain points out that last week the government changed its guidelines to make testing on demand.
Any symptom that is there right now, the fact that even if you don't have symptoms but you are feeling uneasiness in your whole system, then you have to get tested. Several states have been pulled up, especially the bigger states where you're doing the rapid antigen tests, but when persons are developing symptoms, they are not going and getting themselves tested. So that is another factor where you're getting the easy test done, but when you're developing symptoms, you're not getting an RT-PCR test done.
Right now, RT-PCR is the gold standard frontline test for the diagnosis of COVID-19. The big difference between that and the rapid antigen test is that for the rapid antigen test, the results take 2 to 3 hours to come, while in RT-PCR, the results can take at least a day. Moreover, in the rapid antigen test, the chances of a false negative are significantly higher. Plus, it's a test that doesn't require the use of a biosafety lab. Unfortunately, because of this convenience, a lot of states are using the rapid antigen test, which is leading to a lot of cases going under the radar and the virus spreading faster.
So there have been several states who have now been pulled up and been asked to set up 2 teams, one at the district level and one at the state level, to give the central government the data as to how many false negative rapid antigen tests are you getting confirmed with the RT-PCR. So this is the next big issue that is happening, because right now, if you see in the country, we are testing 1 million people per day, but 40% of them on a national average is the rapid antigen test, where you have a big room of false negatives.
Next, we talk about farmer protests. Last week, farmer organizations in Haryana defied orders set amidst the pandemic to hold a rally at a wholesale grain market near Kurukshetra. The farmers had even blocked the Delhi-Chandigarh National Highway for a couple of hours, when the police initially didn't allow them to move to the venue. The farmers were protesting 3 central laws that were put into effect through ordinances on the 5th of June.
There are basically 3 ordinances, of which actually only one of them is of any consequence to farmers, according to me.
That's Harish Damodaran, Indian Express's rural affairs editor. And he first talks about the last 2 ordinances that actually aim to help the farmers. The second of them relates to the Essential Commodities Act and talks about doing away with stock holding limits in farm produce.
Right now, like for example, if say onion prices shoot up, suddenly the government can just say that no trader can hold more than say 1,000 quintals, and we have seen this being done repeatedly in the case of onions, in the case of pulses, in the case of sugar, and in the last 4-5 years. So these, along with the export bans, which have been taking place very regularly. So the second ordinance has to do with removing stock holding limits. I mean, the government's powers to impose stock holding limits would be only in very special, extraordinary circumstances, as they call it, which has to do with all those if there is a national calamity of, I think, grave nature, war, those kind of things.
The third ordinance is a rather innocuous one, he says, called the Farmers' Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Ordinance.
It basically enables contract cultivation. And contract cultivation is basically where, farmers can enter into agreements with, say, a buyer before the start of any planting season to supply a certain quantity of a defined quality, at a given price. So this is just to sort of legalize contract supply arrangements. So I don't think any farmer will have problems with either of these two, and if anything, these are actually good for the farmers. Definitely, I don't think Essential Commodities Act is something which any onion farmer or a pulses farmer would want to know. So the whole issue is to do with the first ordinance, which has to do basically with dismantling the monopoly of APMCs.
APMC mandis, or the Agricultural Produce Market Committee mandis. Farmers are not allowed to sell directly from their farms. They have to bring their produce to APMC mandis, which are regulated.
So basically, the ordinance, what it says is that sale can take place outside APMC mandis also. So the ordinance or the act or the law defines something called a trading area. Okay, and the trade area is basically any place outside the mandi where also purchase and sales of produce can take place. And the APMC will continue, but in APMC, for example, you have mandi cess. An APMC mandi may impose a mandi cess. There may also be some government levies. I think there's something called a rural development cess, which the Punjab government imposes. So those can take place only when any transaction is conducted within the physical boundaries of that particular mandi. But if a farmer were to sell in the farm gate or any other collection center, which is defined as a trade area, it will not attract these levies.
Now, on the surface, even this ordinance seems helpful to the farmers. It gives them more choice of where they can sell their produce and potentially allows them to avoid the payments they have to make at the APMC mandis. But Harish says that the thing to understand is that in some states like Punjab and Haryana, where protests have taken place, and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, there is a well-established system of mandis.
Where the Food Corporation of India plus, state government agencies, they procure grain, they procure mainly paddy and wheat at the government's minimum support prices. So you have an established system there. Okay, so I think farmers are concerned whether that system will be undermined. You can have a scenario where the government will say, yeah, we are anyway giving you choice to sell elsewhere. So why do you have to sell here? So there is a fear. This has more to do with the trust deficit, In fact, there's nothing in the ordinance per se which says that the mandis will be shut down or that the government will stop procuring and all. But basically, in today's scenario, there is a lot of suspicion, there is a lot of distrust. So therefore, farmers now are saying, hey, it's possible that in future, government will not buy.
Plus, Harish says that the other thing on the farmers' minds is a study that was submitted to the government in 2015. The study was headed by the former Food Minister, Shanta Kumar.
So that particular report had very clearly said that FCI, that is the FCI should exit procurement. And everything should be done. The procurement should be handed over entirely to state government agencies. And FCI should not procure from Punjab, from Haryana, from Chhattisgarh, from Madhya Pradesh, and I think even from Odisha. That's what the report had said. So suddenly farmers, more than farmers, actually, it's the farm organizations. The farm organizations, they are now trying to link this thing. Yes, they want to implement the Shanta Kumar committee report. But again, see, even the Shanta Kumar committee, which only says that FCI need not procure, but it said that the state government agencies can procure. Here again, the thing is, see, state governments don't have the money, as we have seen with GST and etc. States don't have the money, Whereas when FCI buys, when FCI takes delivery, it means the center is putting its funds. So farmers, I think, are reading many things. The farm organizations are reading many things. Hey, why are they doing away with mandis? Whereas actually, frankly speaking, in the ordinance itself, there is nothing of this kind. And nowhere has the government said that, we are not going to procure grains anymore, etc.
So in the states like Punjab and Haryana, where the government regularly buys farmers' produce, And where there are well-oiled systems of procurement, for those states, Harish says, mandis are very important.
And they know they'll come there, they bring their grain, and there are the artiyas there. The artiyas are the ones who organize the auction of their grain. And the same artiyas also extend them funds. They give them money, and in turn, they'll say that you sell through us, So there are established relationships. Now, when you're going to break them down, which is what farmers perceive, they say that over a period of time, the mandis will cease to be relevant. And I think there is also another lobby, apart from farmers, there are also the artiyas themselves.
The artiyas get a commission by working in the mandis. So now they fear that they will lose out on earnings if the mandis become irrelevant.
And governments also make money. See, like the Punjab government, for example, I think earns something like 3,500 crore every year, because it imposes basically a mandi fee, which is about 2% of the MSP, plus another 4% of, I think, what they call as a rural development cess. This money in turn is used to build roads and those kind of things. So when you look at this thing, you can say there are three people who are opposed to this. One is the state governments, one is the artiyas, and then the farmers. The farmers come farm organizations. But there again, there is a difference between, I think, what is happening in these states. In these states where you have regular mandis and other states.
In other states like Maharashtra, farm leaders like Raju Shetty have actually welcomed these ordinances. And this, Harish says, has to do with the crops that are grown in the state, like pulses, pomegranates, grapes, or soya bean, things that the government doesn't procure much.
So those farmers will say, hey, man, why should we compulsorily have to sell fruits and vegetables, take it to the mandi? Because there is the cost of transporting the produce, right? You take it there and then you have to wait there for your turn for it. Whereas what they say is, hey, man, if somebody is willing to buy from our village, or even from our farm, why not? So these farmers are talking this particular language, whereas the farmers in Punjab, Haryana, especially you have various factions of the Bharatiya Kisan Union. For them, I think, whatever MSP and those kind of things matter. Whereas for farmers in, say, Karnataka, Maharashtra, etc., MSP is only theoretical. So for them, the main thing is if they can get a better price, the maximum price. Anyway, government is not buying. So it doesn't make any difference to us whether we are selling in the mandi or whether we are selling at a village collection center.
That's why Harish says that these protests are very localized and for now have only been limited to Punjab and Haryana. Though he says that he wouldn't be surprised if they spread to Madhya Pradesh as well.
Wherever farmers have tasted whatever, government support, in all these places, I think there will be a lot of resistance to these three ordinances. And what matters above all is the mahol. See, the present mahol doesn't inspire trust. Forget farmers, with anybody, right? I think general levels of trust with the government have fallen. So many people would ask, hey, what is the need to push these laws? And why come out with ordinances? Couldn't these have been debated? Why don't you place it in the Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha? Let us discuss it. Let us have, what is the need to push through these things? I think the timing, the context, I think these are the things which matter. But per se, I think all the three ordinances are in a way progressive, and at least the letter of these laws nowhere suggests that government will stop procuring, that MSP support will end. There's nothing, at least in the laws. But in these times, you don't look at the law. You also go beyond the law, the spirit of the law, the context where it is happening. And generally, because governments don't have funds, there's no money, so they want to somehow save money. You have to see this in the overall context.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.